Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Brownlow with Adept Psychology. I'd like to talk about something that I call the earthworm brain. Now, unless you've been in one of my paid programs in the past, you've probably never heard that saying before, and you've never heard these ideas before. So for right now, just kind of relax, take a little time, and absorb what I'm going to tell you. My ideas about the earthworm brain really started with the work of a physician named Paul MacLean, who back in the 60s gained some fame and prominence for a theory that he proposed that he called the triune brain. And essentially what he argued was that our brain has three different levels. We have the inner level sort of down by our brainstem that we share with vertebrates. He called that the reptilian brain. On top of that are a different set of structures that control those first set of structures, and that second set of structures we have in common with early mammals, rats, and so forth. And then on the outside of that, there's a third set of structures that we really only share with higher primates, particularly humans. In evolution, everything builds on the structures and functions that were there previously. What used to be a function now becomes sort of a subroutine, I guess you'd call it, in computer language. And so what used to be state of the art is now sort of just part of what we do that we then incorporate into something bigger. And so what I want to talk about is what I call the earthworm brain. Now, to talk about that, we need to think about earthworms a little bit. We've all seen earthworms. We all kind of know what an earthworm is, but I want to just say very briefly what an earthworm is and what an earthworm does, what it takes to be a good earthworm. My definition of an earthworm, the way I think about an earthworm, is that an earthworm is essentially a little biological tube. And this tube lives underground. It lives in the soil. And the tube has a front end and a back end. And through a process of contraction, it shortens itself and elongates itself, and by doing that, it moves through the soil. The front end moves in, and as the front end of the tube moves further into the soil moves into the front end of the tube. And then it kind of scrunches up and then moves forward some more, and as it does that, more soil is added to the front, which forces the soil that was already in the tube toward the back of the tube, and eventually so much soil is forced in that the soil that was at one point in the front of the tube gets forced out the back end of the tube. What's really ingenious about earthworms is that somehow in the process of this tube moving through the soil, it's able to take in enough nutrients, fuel, whatever, to keep the tube moving forward through the soil. I kind of think of it as like a perpetual motion machine. Just the act of moving forward provides it with the energy to continue moving forward in the same way. Ingenious design. The second question is, what does it take to be a good earthworm? And I'd say there's, again, just kind of a handful of things. You have to know that you're in soil and that you're digging through soil. You don't want to dig through another earthworm, because you do kind of want other earthworms. Earthworms mate, and you don't want to dig through yourself if you double back on yourself somehow. That's not good. And so you need to know that this is soil and that's other earthworms and this is maybe another living thing and this is me. You also need to know that if it's a rock or a tree root or something, you really can't dig through that. And so if there's some kind of an obstacle in the way, you have to have some awareness that, oh, we've hit an obstacle and we need to move around it. Earthworms, if you move into tainted soil, it's poisoned somehow. There's something wrong with the soil. An earthworm needs to know, oh, this is dangerous. I need to stay away from this. I need to get out of here in a hurry, and I need to avoid this area, because if I don't, then I won't be able to continue moving forward anymore. Something bad will happen to me. The last thing about earthworms is, and you know this if you've ever accidentally hit one when you're gardening with a shovel or something, or you've put one on a fish hook or seen one get put on a fish hook, you know that earthworms may not feel pain the way we do, but they certainly writhe about a lot when their integrity is damaged. Their structural external integrity is damaged. So they definitely, whether they feel pain or not, they definitely are aware of what we would call pain. What's interesting about earthworms is that they have what we would, I guess we'd have to call a brain. It's not located in the front of the earthworm, what we would consider its head. It doesn't really have a head, but where along the length of this entire tube there are neurons that are connected to one another. They're all interconnected, and somehow this set of neurons learns and forms plans and does those kinds of things. In the size of an earthworm's brain, in terms of neurons, we're talking about maybe, depending on the worm, maybe a few hundred neurons or something like that. So why am I talking about earthworms and their brains? Well, as it turns out, you have that same tube running through you from top to bottom. We call it our digestive system. And in fact, you have the same kinds of neural arrangements in your digestive system that an earthworm has in its body. We call it our enteric nervous system, or sometimes it's called our enteric brain. It's mostly contained in our intestines, small and large. Whereas an earthworm might have maybe a few hundred neurons, our enteric nervous system has a few 100,000,000 neurons. In fact, in size and complexity, our enteric nervous system is about equivalent to the brain of a common house cat. Our enteric nervous system seems to be responsible for the same things that it's responsible for in an earthworm. Now you wonder, how can that happen? Well, as it turns out, our brain farms out lots of stuff to be processed. And so for every one bit of information that our brain sends to the enteric nervous system for processing, about 15 to 20 bits come back to the brain. So this stuff is not very amenable to control from our brain. We're really more controlled by our enteric system, our earthworm brain. We have to know where we start and we end, and what the environment is about, and what other people are and what they're about, and whether they're suitable for mating. We have a very elaborated system of that. We tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about our environment, about other people, about what's going on, about how the world is treating us, and so forth and so on. And that seems to originate in our enteric nervous system. We also need to know if there's danger, if something is tainted, and we need to know if there's an impediment and how we can move around it. And we need to know how to avoid pain. We do that in a much more elaborated way than an earthworm does. If we anticipate pain to our physical body, we send ourselves a signal that we call fear. If we think that we are in an area where we are about to ingest something that's going to hurt us, then we send signals to ourselves that we call disgust. At first, those things are smells and tastes, but later it becomes ideas that can disgust us. The third thing is that when somehow maybe our physical body's not threatened, but our stories are threatened. And when that happens, we send ourselves signals, our enteric brain sends us signals that are kind of a mixture between fear and disgust. It's both withdrawal and avoidance. We call that anxiety. The fourth signal is that somehow our enteric brain can decide that none of that's going on anymore, and it withdraws all of those signals very quickly and immediately. And when that happens, we experience something that we call relief. And finally, when all of those things are quieted, the fear, the disgust, the anxiety, when it's all quieted, we can start picking up another signal that's been sending all along, which is about how to move around the impediments and obstacles in our lives. When we don't really know, we don't know what's in front of us, but we've hit something and we need to figure out what we're going to do next. And we call that intuition. When we talk about stories, when we talk about disgust and fear and anxiety and relief, the word we commonly use to describe how all of that fits together is ego. When we look at how we put ourselves in boxes and we straitjacket ourselves and we defend ourselves and avoid experience, we're talking about our ego. We're talking about our input from our enteric nervous system. We're talking about something that's been elaborated but hasn't really changed in its function and structure much since the days of earthworms. We're talking about something that's not under the conscious control of our higher primate mind. My practical tip for this time is that you start examining, mindfully examining how your ego works. Listen to the stories it's telling you. Observe how it tries to control you through fear, anxiety, disgust, and occasionally relief. We'll talk more about the ego in future videos. For now, keep your questions coming. Until next time, this is Dr. Stephen Brownlow. We'll see you soon.